My name is Irene Marshall. I am 50 years old, and for most of my life, I was the woman who held everything together. I raised our son, cared for my aging mother-in-law, cooked every meal, paid every bill, and stayed quiet so the house could stay peaceful. Yet there I stood beside my husband as we went to look at an apartment being sold by a foreign owner. The moment we stepped inside, I kept quiet and pretended I did not understand German. But then I heard one sentence that made me freeze. I could not believe what I was hearing. The words hit me with the weight of 20 years. The apartment was beautiful in a cold and distant way. Marble floors polished to a mirror, tall windows pouring in winter light, and the faint scent of wood and varnish. Harold walked ahead of me with the confidence of a man who believed the world tilted in his favor. The seller, a tall and composed man named Matthias Bauer, greeted us in accented English. Harold answered politely, then switched into German with a prideful little smirk, believing I could not follow. I stood still, running my hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen counter, listening. My heart beat slowly, almost quietly, as Harold spoke about the square footage and the view of the river below. Matthias nodded, his voice patient and steady. The two men walked toward the balcony doors, and I stayed behind, pretending to marvel at the architecture. I turned my face slightly, angling my ear toward them. Years ago, no one would have imagined that a middle-aged woman like me would spend quiet nights with a small dictionary, tracing unfamiliar letters under a bedside lamp. No one knew that grief had driven me to learn. No one asked. Harold's tone shifted, lowering with intention. His voice in German was sharper, more arrogant, more revealing than the English he saved for public charm. He told Matthias that the papers should be written in his name only, that I did not understand anything being discussed, that I was merely furniture in the home, a decoration, a thing that stayed where it was placed, a woman who belonged to silence. The words struck me harder than a shout. My spine felt as if it had turned to glass. I kept my breathing even, my shoulders relaxed, my expression calm. My fingers tightened against the edge of the counter. The cool surface grounded me. The world around me seemed to slow as though the air had thickened. I looked toward the balcony where Matthias stood facing Harold. He lifted his eyes and they met mine. It lasted only a second, but I knew he understood. Something shifted in his gaze, recognition, sympathy, and a subtle warning. Harold continued speaking, unaware that the foundation of his certainty had cracked. He said that women my age should be grateful for whatever roof they were given, that I would sign anything without question, that I was harmless and obedient. The humiliation did not come from the words themselves, but from the ease with which he said them, as if they had lived inside him for years. At that moment, memories flooded me without invitation. The nights I stayed awake with a feverish child while he slept, the dinners that went uneaten after he decided to impress colleagues instead, the years of birthdays he forgot. In the afternoons, he dismissed me with a wave of his hand, the countless times I swallowed my voice to keep the peace, the sacrifices erased. The woman was invisible. Matthias cleared his throat gently. He shifted his stance and responded in a measured tone. His words, still in German, suggested that respect was customary in any transaction. Harold laughed lightly, brushing it aside. I straightened my posture and stepped toward them. Neither man spoke for a moment. The room felt suspended in a fragile quiet. My voice remained silent, but my eyes told a different story. Inside my mind, a sentence formed with clarity. I heard everything, but I stayed silent. For the last time. My heartbeat steadied. My breath became calm. I felt a strange sensation rising in me, not rage, not sorrow, but something firmer, something that had been growing quietly for a long time. I turned toward the window and looked out at the river below, the water moving with a patient determination, the kind of movement that carved stone over time, the kind of movement no one could see happening until the shape had already changed. The moment froze in my memory like a photograph, the winter light, the quiet humiliation, the unseen strength. If someone were watching from the outside, they might think nothing had happened, but I knew it was different. A tide had shifted, a chapter had ended, a journey had begun, cut to black. If this opening pulled you in, tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you will not miss the next chapter of my story. Your support keeps these quiet but powerful journeys alive. When the memory of that apartment faded into the background of my mind, another memory rose to the surface with a quiet ache. It happened the way thoughts do when they are ready to be faced. Not loud, but steady. I sat at my small kitchen table later that evening, and the silence around me felt familiar. It was the same silence that had followed me for years, the kind that wraps itself around a woman who learned long ago that speaking did not guarantee she would be heard. I rested my hands together and let my thoughts travel backward, as if confiding in a friend who already knew the shape of my heart. I used to be the foundation of our home. I was the one who woke before sunrise to pack lunches, iron shirts, answer school emails, juggle appointments, and soothe tired tempers. When our son Evan was little, he clung to my hand everywhere we went, trusting me with the certainty only a child can have. I held that trust gently. I guided him through scraped knees, science fairs, sleepless nights, and first heartbreaks. I watched him grow into a young man ready for college, and although pride filled me, something else filled the space he left behind. The walls of the house sounded different, without his laughter bouncing between them. I also cared for Harold's mother until her final breath. She was fragile near the end, and her memory slipped in and out like a lantern flickering in the wind. I fed her, bathed her, read to her, and held her hand when she became frightened by shadows she could not name. Harold visited her only when reminded. He praised me in front of others, saying I had a gift for caregiving. But praise offered in public and disregard offered in private create a wound only a woman of the house can understand. There was a time when I had my own world. I used to teach English at a small community school, and my classroom felt alive with curiosity. I loved watching young minds discover how words could unlock meaning. I left that job because the house needed me, or at least that was what Harold said. He told me it made more sense, that it was practical, that a good wife prioritized family. I believed him. I folded my resignation letter and placed it in an envelope with a strange heaviness in my chest. I never returned to that building again. Years passed, and no one mentioned it. Eventually, I even stopped mentioning it. After Evan moved out to start his life, something changed in Harold. It was subtle at first. A comment here, a sigh there, a look that is dismissed rather than acknowledged. Then, one evening, while he sat in his leather chair with a newspaper folded across his lap, he said in a careless tone that no one needed a woman my age anymore. The sentence landed like cold water down my spine. He said it the way someone remarks on the weather, as if it were a harmless observation. I nodded as though it did not sting. I learned long ago that some men mistake a woman's silence for agreement, when in truth it is simply survival. There's an object I keep hidden in the drawer of my bedside table, a small German dictionary with worn edges and a faded blue cover. It was the last gift from my foster daughter, Elena. She came into our lives like a warm breeze, gentle and kind. She loved languages and believed words could build bridges between souls. When illness took her, she pressed the dictionary into my hands and told me to learn something for myself, not for the house, not for duty. For me. I promised her I would. I kept that promise in quiet hours while the world slept. The book feels heavier than its size suggests. It carries grief, love, and the seed of my awakening. Sometimes I speak very little, not because I lack thoughts, but because emptiness sits where conversation used to live. I learned to move through rooms quietly, to avoid taking up space, to shrink in small ways so others could stretch in careless ways. There were days when I forgot the sound of my own laughter. There were mornings when I looked into the mirror and wondered when my reflection had stopped looking back. Now, when I think about the silence in that apartment and the words Harold thought I did not understand, I realize something important. My silence was not a weakness. It was exhausting. It was the final layer covering years of dismissal, sacrifice, and loneliness. Anyone watching my life from the outside might never have known, but those who listen with their hearts will understand why I did not speak. They will understand why a quiet woman finally reaches a moment when silence becomes impossible to carry. Thinking about that small German dictionary brings me back to the moment Elena first arrived in our home. Remembering her is like opening a window and letting sunlight fall across a room that has been dim for too long. She was only 12 when she came to live with us as a foster placement, yet she carried a gentleness that seemed older than her years. She had eyes that noticed everything, not in a judging way, but with a quiet curiosity, as if she was always searching for the hidden softness in the world. She called me Mom from the 3rd week onward, not loudly, not ceremoniously, but with a simple certainty that wrapped itself around my heart. It felt like a new beginning. Elena loved languages. She said that words could stitch broken hearts back together and help strangers understand one another. She would sit at the table with her notebooks spread out, practicing alphabets and pronunciation with a determination that made me smile. Sometimes she would read to me in German, her voice light and melodic, and then translate every line with care. She told me that learning opened doors we did not even know existed. I listened, captivated by the way she believed in growth, even in a world that had not always been kind to her. When her illness came, it came quietly at first. Fatigue, pale cheeks, short breaths. Then came the hospital rooms and whispered conversations. I stayed beside her as much as I could, and she would rest with her hand in mine. One evening, when the machines hummed at a steady rhythm and the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender lotion, she spoke to me with a seriousness that startled me. She said that I spent my whole life caring for others, that I poured myself into everyone around me, that I deserved to learn something for myself. She told me to promise that I would not stop living simply because she would no longer be there to remind me. I nodded with tears stinging my eyes, unable to speak. She squeezed my fingers and whispered that life was still waiting for me. Her last gift was that little German dictionary. She handed it to me with a weak smile. The edges of the book were slightly frayed, and there was a ribbon marking a page in the middle. She said that if I ever felt lost, I should open it and remember that I was still allowed to grow, still allowed to dream, still allowed to begin again. When she passed, the weight of that small book felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. I kept it near, yet I could not open it for months. Then, one night, long after the house had gone silent and Harold had fallen asleep in front of the television, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside me. The grief felt different that night, less like a storm and more like an ache that asked to be tended. I reached for the dictionary and opened it. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the first page. I sounded out words quietly, almost shyly, like someone learning how to use her voice again. Each night I returned to it, not because I wanted to be fluent, but because the act of learning felt like honoring her. The words became a thread pulling me forward. I kept this ritual hidden. I studied when the world was asleep, when there was no one to interrupt me or question my choice. I copied phrases into a notebook and repeated them softly until they began to feel familiar. Something inside me stirred, something that had been dormant for years. I felt a spark, small but persistent, a reminder that my mind still had places to explore. It was the first time in a long while that I did something that belonged only to me. Harold discovered me once, sitting with the dictionary open. He walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and looked at me with a puzzled expression. He asked why I was awake. When he saw the book, he chuckled with disbelief. He asked what a woman my age thought she would gain from learning a language. He said it was pointless, that it was a hobby for people with time to waste, that I should get some sleep because there were chores waiting in the morning. His tone carried that familiar note of dismissal. I closed the book gently and offered no defense. Silence wrapped around me like armor. I realized that arguing would only feed his certainty. So I said nothing. And in that nothing, I found a strange sense of power. That night marked the first time my silence was not submission, but choice. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. I simply held my ground without needing to prove anything. When he returned to bed, I reopened the dictionary and continued studying. My heart beat steadily, fueled by a quiet determination. It was then that I understood what Elena had meant. Learning was not just about words. It was about reclaiming pieces of myself that I had set aside for too long. It was the beginning of a fire that would grow slowly, patiently, until it was strong enough to change everything. Returning to the present felt like resurfacing from deep water. The memory of my late-night studies and the quiet fire they sparked faded as I stood again in that apartment with its soaring ceilings and polished floors. The air inside carried a subtle scent of cedar and something floral, like perfume that lingered long after its owner had left. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, stretching across the floor in soft golden bands. I moved slowly, letting my fingertips trail along the smooth stone countertop and the curved metal railing of the staircase. Every detail felt deliberate. Every corner whispered of a life designed with intention rather than obligation. The space was quiet, yet it held a presence that made me feel strangely awake. Matthias stood near the window, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. There was something refined about him, not in a showy way, but in a way that suggested depth and history. His voice carried warmth when he spoke, even when his expression remained reserved. He asked if I liked the view, and I nodded gently. He smiled with a softness that felt genuine. There was kindness in the way he looked at me, as though he sensed the tension that sat beneath my calm surface. It was the first time in a long while that someone regarded me without impatience or disregard. Harold, on the other hand, moved through the apartment like a man auditioning for admiration. He commented loudly on the crown molding, the imported fixtures, the European hinges, and the river view. His tone swelled with pride, as though the apartment itself were proof of his superiority. He gestured toward me with a dismissive wave, referring to me as though I were an accessory rather than a partner. His laugh bounced off the pristine walls, sharp and grating. I stayed silent, observing the contrast between the two men. There was a moment when Matthias and I found ourselves standing near one another while Harold wandered through the hallway. He asked in a quiet tone if I enjoyed living in the city. I answered softly that I enjoyed quiet places more. He nodded with understanding, his eyes holding a flicker of recognition I could not yet place. Something passed between us, not attraction, but awareness. Knowing that only comes from shared experience. Later, I learned why. Harold returned, clearing his throat dramatically before switching into German again. He launched into a boastful monologue, speaking about finances, ownership, and independence. He told Matthias that the purchase would be in his name alone, that his wife did not understand such matters, that she preferred to stay out of decisions. The words stung, not because they were surprising, but because they revealed the truth he had always believed. He spoke with the confidence of someone who never expected to be challenged. I stood still, pretending not to notice, pretending not to listen. The ache in my chest deepened, spreading like ink across paper. I heard every syllable. It felt as though 20 years of shared life had been reduced to a sentence spoken carelessly in a foreign language. My hands felt cold. My breath became thin. I kept my posture steady because collapsing would give him victory. Silence became my shield again, but this time it trembled. Matthias paused before responding. His voice, still in German, was calm and firm. He said that partnerships were built on respect and that dignity was not optional. His tone was measured, but his eyes carried a quiet fire. It was at that moment that I realized he was not merely polite. He was protective. Later, I discovered the reason. He once had a daughter who had been controlled by someone who spoke to her the way Harold spoke about me. The grief in his eyes was subtle but unmistakable. He looked at me not with pity, but with empathy. Harold laughed and brushed off his words. He said that he knew how to handle his household. He said that some women were happiest when quiet. He said it with a certainty that made my stomach tighten. I stared at the reflection in the glass door of the balcony. My face looked composed, but my eyes betrayed the fracture spreading beneath the surface. Inside, a sentence formed with painful clarity. 20 years together, and in his eyes I was nothing more than an object, a piece of furniture. something that stayed where it was placed. My pulse beat in my ears. The room tilted slightly, though I did not move. A memory flashed of all the years I cooked his meals, mended his clothes, hosted his colleagues, and held his mother's hand as she faded from the world. None of it mattered. The realization settled like a stone in my chest. It was not that he changed. It was that I finally heard him without an illusion. Matthias glanced at me again, and in that moment I knew he understood that I understood. There was no rescue in his gaze, only acknowledgement. A reminder that I was not invisible. I drew in a breath, slow and steady. The kind of breath taken before a turning point. The apartment around me felt like a stage, and I was stepping into a role I had never played before. The role of a woman who saw clearly. The ride home from the apartment felt strangely quiet, even though Harold filled the car with his voice. The city lights slid across the windshield in long streaks, and the evening traffic hummed around us like a distant tide. Harold tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, energized by his own excitement. He spoke about paint colors, furniture placement, and the impression the apartment would make on his colleagues. He talked about how it would symbolize a new chapter for him, a step into a higher circle, a life he believed he deserved. His voice rose and fell with a confident rhythm, and he never once asked what I thought. He did not slow down long enough to notice that I had not spoken since we left the building. He said that the balcony would be perfect for entertaining. He said that people would admire the way he secured such a valuable property. He said that the paperwork would go quickly if I did not complicate things. Then he laughed, as though the idea of me complicating anything was amusing. I stared out the window at passing storefronts and the blurred silhouettes of pedestrians. Their lives moved with purpose, while mine felt suspended between what had been and what could no longer continue. My hands rested on my lap, still and composed, even though my chest felt heavy. At a stoplight, Harold glanced at me, expecting admiration. He asked if I understood how important this purchase was for him. My voice came out calm, steady, and nearly weightless. I told him I understood. Just 2 simple words, not because I agreed, but because I finally saw clearly. Those words hovered in the space between us, and for a moment he looked satisfied, as though my quietness confirmed his belief that everything was firmly under his control. The light turned green and he drove on, humming to himself. I did not cry. The tears that once came so easily stayed where they were, untouched. I had cried in the past when he dismissed me, ignored me, or belittled me. I had cried when I realized my sacrifices were invisible to him. But that night there were no tears. Something deeper than sadness settled inside me, something still and grounded. It was the quiet understanding that there was nothing left to salvage in the version of our life he believed we shared. Silence wrapped around me again, but it felt different now. It was no longer the silence of surrender. It was the silence of awakening. When we arrived home, Harold headed straight to his study with a stack of brochures tucked under his arm. He told me to remind him in the morning to contact the realtor and arrange a transfer. Then he closed the door behind him without waiting for my response. I stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of the door clicking into place. The house felt colder than usual, though the heat was running. I walked slowly to the kitchen and filled the kettle, letting the familiar ritual anchor me. The steam rose in soft wisps, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug as though it could steady the shifting ground beneath me. Later, when the house darkened and Harold's steady snoring filled the bedroom, I sat alone in the dim glow of a small lamp. The night outside was still, and the air held a crisp quietness that sharpened my thoughts. I opened the drawer of my bedside table and took out the little German dictionary. Its worn cover felt comforting beneath my fingers. I opened it to a blank page at the back and held a pen poised above the paper. My heart beat slowly, not with fear, but with purpose. I wrote a sentence in careful, deliberate strokes. The ink flowed smoothly, forming each word with clarity. I wrote that I would rise. The simplicity of it carried the weight of every moment that led me there. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was a vow made in silence, stronger than any declaration spoken in anger. I stared at the words for a long while, letting them settle into me. I felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like a flame catching after smoldering beneath the surface for years. The house remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt like space to think, space to breathe, space to step into myself without asking permission. I closed the dictionary and held it against my chest for a moment. Elena's memory felt near, like a hand resting gently on my shoulder. I imagined her smiling, not with sadness, but with recognition. She had seen this moment long before I did. When I finally stood and turned off the lamp, the darkness did not feel empty. It felt like a doorway, the beginning of something new, built not from rebellion, but from truth. Anyone watching might have thought nothing significant had occurred, but those who have lived through quiet wounds would understand. The pivot had begun, not with shouting, but with stillness, not with rage, but with a decision. The morning after I wrote in my dictionary, I stepped outside to take out the trash. The air was cool and the sky held the gray tint of early dawn. As I reached the curb, I saw my neighbor, Marjorie Ellery, standing near her porch with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a soft bun and eyes that had seen more than she ever said aloud. She lifted a hand in greeting, and I walked toward her. There was something grounding about her presence, like the steady glow of a lantern in a long hallway. She asked if I had been sleeping well. I hesitated before answering. Somehow she already knew that I had not. She had a way of listening that made silence feel like part of the conversation. We stood side by side, watching the street slowly brighten. After a moment, she spoke in a voice softened by age, yet sharpened by truth. She said she recognized the look I carried. She said she had once worn it herself. I felt my breath catch, though I kept my expression calm. Marjorie told me she had lived most of her life controlled by her husband. She said he dictated what she wore, where she went, how she spoke, and even what she felt. She said she stayed because she believed it was her duty, because society told her endurance was noble, because leaving felt like failure. Then she said something that echoed through me like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. She said that if I did not walk away soon, I would end up like her, free only when I no longer had the strength to live the freedom I finally earned. The words lingered in the morning air. I felt them settle into me, heavy yet clarifying. She turned and looked directly into my eyes. There was no judgment there, only a painful honesty that came from experience. She said she did not want another woman to learn the lesson too late. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. She reached out and gently touched my arm, then lowered her hand and looked out toward the street again. Harold stepped outside at that moment, calling out a reminder about the realtor. His tone was brisk, impatient, and oblivious to the gravity of the conversation he interrupted. I answered him with the same calm voice as the night before, telling him I understood. He nodded and went back inside without acknowledging Marjorie. The door closed behind him, punctuating the moment like a period at the end of a sentence. Marjorie exhaled slowly. She said that men like Harold believed women existed to accommodate them. She said that when Evan left home, Harold lost his audience and turned his attention toward diminishing me. She said it was a common pattern and that many women blamed themselves for the change. I stood still, letting her words move through me like a slow current. She told me that silence could be a bridge, but it could also be a cage. She asked me softly which one mine had become. A flock of birds crossed the sky above us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. My mind replayed Harold's voice in the car, his laughter, his certainty. Then it played Elena's voice, gentle, urging me to learn something for myself. The two voices collided inside me, and I realized that I stood at a threshold. I could continue as I had been, shrinking to fit inside the shape he preferred, or I could step toward a life that belonged to me. The choice felt both terrifying and inevitable. Marjorie shifted her shawl and said that she admired my composure. She said that quiet strength was often mistaken for weakness, but that those who held it could move mountains without making a sound. She told me that when she finally left her marriage, she felt both relief and regret. relief that she had escaped, and regret that she waited until her body was tired and her spirit worn. She said she hoped that if I chose to walk away, I would do it while I still had enough years to enjoy the life waiting for me. Her words opened a question inside me, a question I knew every listener would ask themselves. Was it better to stay for the sake of history, or to leave for the sake of a future still possible? I felt the moral conflict settle like a stone in my chest. I thanked her, not with enthusiasm, but with sincerity. She nodded, as though she understood that gratitude could be quiet too. That evening, after Harold fell asleep in his chair with the television flickering across his face, I stood in the quiet kitchen with the dictionary resting in my hands. The house felt suspended, as though holding its breath. I remembered the way Matthias had looked at me in the apartment, and a thought surfaced gently but firmly. I realized that if I wanted to step into a life that belonged to me, I could not do it alone. I needed information, guidance, and someone who understood more than the surface of what had happened. My fingers hesitated for a moment, then I picked up the phone and dialed the number written on the brochure Harold had left on the counter. The phone rang twice before Matthias answered. His voice was calm, and when he said his name, I replied in German. The words came slowly but clearly, shaped by the nights I spent studying. I told him that I understood everything he and Harold had said at the apartment. There was a long pause on the other end, filled not with discomfort, but with surprise. He asked if I wanted to continue in German or switch to English. I told him I preferred to stay in German because it reminded me of why I started learning in the first place. His tone softened, and he spoke with careful respect. He said he had suspected I understood, but had not been certain. He asked if I was safe. I assured him that Harold was not violent, only diminishing. He exhaled slowly, and I could almost hear the memory of his daughter in the sound. He told me that I did not have to endure the situation silently. I told him that I was considering leaving and that I needed to know what steps to take. He hesitated, then said he could introduce me to a lawyer who specialized in situations like mine. His offer was not intrusive, it was practical and respectful. I felt something inside me settle. I thanked him in German, and he responded by saying that any woman with the courage to learn a new language in the dark of night had the courage to reclaim her life. After I hung up, the kitchen felt different, as though the air had shifted. I sat down with a notebook and began writing questions about finances, property, and rights. The next morning, while Harold was out making calls about the apartment he believed he already owned, I met with the lawyer in a quiet office downtown. She was composed, intelligent, and spoke with clarity that cut through uncertainty like a clean blade. I explained my situation, and she listened without rushing me. When I finished, she folded her hands and told me what I had not expected to hear. She said that most of our assets were in joint accounts, but legally they skewed toward Harold. She explained that because I had not earned income for years, the courts could interpret the contributions as his alone unless proven otherwise. She told me that the house, the savings, and even the retirement funds were largely in his name. She said that if I left without preparation, I could walk away with almost nothing. The words settled in my stomach like ice. I felt the room tilt slightly, though I kept my expression steady. She said that it was not hopeless, but that I would need documentation, records, and evidence of my contributions over the years. Walking home, the wind felt colder than usual. My steps were slow and my heartbeat was heavy. I thought of the years I spent raising Evan, caring for Harold's mother, maintaining the home, and supporting Harold's ambitions. None of it had been considered work by those who benefited from it, yet every hour had been labor. Every sacrifice had been real. I reached the front gate and stood there for a moment, staring at the house I had held together for so long. A sentence formed in my mind with painful clarity. I had given everything, and no one knew. I had held the foundation, and no one remembered. Inside, Harold greeted me with cheerful arrogance. He said he had scheduled meetings about the apartment, and that he was confident everything would move quickly. He did not ask where I had been. He did not notice the steadiness in my voice when I told him I understood. He did not see the shift taking place inside me. He believed the world remained shaped in the image he recognized. He did not know that the ground beneath him had begun to change. That night, after he went to bed, I opened the dictionary again. I turned to the page where I had written that I would rise. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the weight of the promise. The fear was real, but so was the resolve. I began gathering documents quietly: bank statements, medical bills, receipts, photographs, letters. Evidence that my life had been built in service, not idleness. Evidence that my years mattered. Evidence that my existence held weight. I placed everything into a folder and hid it beneath the floorboard under the bed. Anyone watching from the outside might say nothing had changed, but the truth was already forming. I was no longer standing still. I was moving, quietly and deliberately, toward a life I would claim for myself. The morning the silence finally cracked began like any other. I was in the kitchen pouring tea when I heard the sound of drawers opening in Harold's study. Papers shifted, folders slid, and then came the unmistakable pause that follows a discovery someone was never meant to find. I kept my breathing steady, holding the warm mug between my palms. A moment later, his footsteps approached, heavy and uneven, like a man whose certainty had been shaken. He entered the kitchen holding the folder I had prepared, the one containing the documents the lawyer told me to gather. His face was flushed, and his voice trembled with disbelief rather than anger. He asked me what the papers were. I answered calmly that they were filing for divorce. The silence that followed felt thick, like fog rolling in from the sea. He stared at me as though he did not recognize the woman standing in front of him. He asked if I was leaving him at this age, as though the number of years lived dictated the number of years one was allowed to change. His voice rose, demanding explanation, justification, apology. I did not offer any. I told him that he had left me long before I decided to leave him. I said it in a tone as even as still water. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. For the first time in our marriage, he did not know what to say. He searched my face for outrage, tears, or fear. He found none. My calmness unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. He stepped back a little, as though the air around me had shifted, and he no longer knew how close he was allowed to stand. He tried to regain control, saying that marriages go through phases. He said that every couple has rough seasons. He said that leaving was irrational and dramatic. His hands gestured sharply, searching for dominance in a room that no longer responded to him. I set my mug down gently and looked at him with steady eyes. I reminded him of the years I cared for his mother while he traveled. I reminded him of the birthdays he forgot, the decisions he made without me. The words he spoke in German reduced me to an object in his mind. He blinked rapidly, as though trying to erase the memory of his own cruelty. He raised his voice, asking why I had not told him I was unhappy. I told him I had many times, but in ways he never bothered to hear. I said that silence was not the absence of communication. It was what remained after every attempt had been ignored. His face tightened, and he looked away for a moment, his jaw clenching. He asked if there was another man. I almost laughed at the irony. A man who never truly saw me now believed someone else must have. I told him that there was no one but myself, and that reclaiming my own life was reason enough. He accused me of being ungrateful. He said he provided for me. I asked him whether providing meant ownership. The question hung in the air like a suspended bell. He could not answer. His certainty fractured again. He asked what I expected to do on my own. He asked how I would live. His voice carried disbelief, but beneath it was something closer to fear. I told him that I would live by learning, by working, by breathing without shrinking. I said it with a calmness that was stronger than any shout. He demanded to know when I made the decision. I told him that the moment he spoke in German and assumed I could not understand, the decision began forming. The moment I realized I was invisible to the man whose life I had held together. He paced the floor, gripping the folder. His steps grew uneven. He said that he never meant to hurt me. I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that intention did not erase impact. The room fell quiet again. This time the silence belonged to me. I stood tall, grounded in a strength he had never witnessed. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he asked what he was supposed to tell people. I told him that what he told others was no longer my concern. The words were gentle, but final. He stared at me for a long moment, realizing that the balance of power had shifted. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble. I did not apologize. The silence between us was no longer something he controlled. It was mine. After Harold fell silent, the house seemed to exhale. He retreated to his study, leaving the divorce papers on the counter as though distance might undo them. I remained at the table, my hands resting lightly on the wood surface, my breathing calm. The confrontation had come and gone without chaos, without shouting, without collapse. Yet beneath the stillness, another truth pressed forward, one I had carried alone for years. It rose slowly, as though it had been waiting for the exact moment when I finally had room to speak it, even if only to myself. I stood and walked into the bedroom, opening the small wooden box where I kept Elena's belongings. Inside were folded drawings, a bracelet made of colored string, a faded photograph, and a bundle of letters tied with a narrow ribbon. The paper was delicate, the ink slightly smudged from the years. I held them gently, the way one holds something that still possesses breath in memory. These letters were written in German, and they were the reason I began learning the language in the first place. Not for travel, not for culture, not for entertainment. For love, for remembrance, for a promise made to a child who trusted me with her final wishes. I sat on the edge of the bed and untied the ribbon. The first letter trembled slightly in my hand. I read it slowly, savoring the meaning behind each line. Matthias had written to Elena during her treatments. He had offered encouragement, stories of places she hoped to visit, and gentle wisdom about surviving pain. His words were tender, protective, and full of belief in her. He told her that life was not measured by length, but by depth. He told her she mattered. When she grew too weak to respond, he continued writing anyway, sending letters even when she could no longer hold a pen. No one ever knew that Matthias had helped pay for her treatments. He never asked for acknowledgement. He never wanted gratitude. He did it quietly, the way good men do when generosity comes from the heart rather than from the desire to be seen. When Elena passed, these letters arrived one final time, along with a note explaining that he would stop writing only because she no longer needed to read. The envelope was addressed to me, and inside, he told me to live in a way that honored the love she carried for the world. For years, I kept this truth tucked away. I did not tell Harold because he would have dismissed it as insignificant. I did not tell Evan because I wanted his memories of childhood to remain untouched. I did not tell Marjorie because some griefs feel more sacred when kept close. And so I learned German alone, night after night, sounding out syllables like prayer beads. The first full letter I understood without the dictionary left me in tears, not from sorrow, but from connection. It was as though Elena were speaking again through the words of a man who had seen her light. As I sat with the letters, I realized something else. The moment Matthias looked at me in the apartment was not only recognition of disrespect toward a woman, it was recognition of loss. He had known Elena. He had loved her in the way a mentor loves a brilliant young soul. And when he understood that I could comprehend his words, he also understood that I carried her memory with me. The world suddenly felt smaller, not in limitation, but in the way threads weave lives together unexpectedly. A tear slipped down my cheek, but it was gentle, not heavy. I whispered to Elena that I was keeping my promise. I told her that learning had saved me in ways I could never have predicted. I told her that her life continued to shape mine even now. The room felt warmer, as though memory itself offered comfort. I placed the letters back in the box, tied the ribbon, and closed the lid with care. When I walked into the living room, Harold looked up at me with confusion and uncertainty. For the first time, he seemed smaller, not physically, but in presence. He asked why I learned German. His voice was thin, almost fragile. I met his eyes and told him the truth. I told him that I learned so I could read the letters written to the girl he barely acknowledged, the girl who called me Mom with her whole heart. I told him that Matthias had funded her treatments when we could not afford them. I told him that while he forgot birthdays, another man remembered kindness. Harold stared at me as though the ground beneath him had vanished. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence that followed was not mine to carry anymore. It was his. The truth sat between us like a quiet revelation, reshaping the room, reshaping the history of our marriage, reshaping the story he told himself about the life we lived. Anyone listening would feel their breath catch. Anyone watching would understand why I stayed silent for so long and why I could not stay silent anymore. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity, like a storm gathering without thunder. Harold tried to return to his routines, but the balance between us had shifted. He walked through the house with distracted movements, pacing more than usual, sighing loudly as though the weight on his shoulders might draw sympathy. I watched without engaging. The divorce papers remained on his desk, and each time he glanced at them, his jaw clenched with growing discomfort. The silence he once demanded now pressed against him with suffocating force. The first consequence arrived in the form of a phone call. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when I heard his voice rise in agitation from the other room. He repeated himself several times, asking for clarification, insisting there must be a mistake. When he hung up, he walked into the kitchen looking pale and unsettled. He said the deposit for the apartment could not be withdrawn from our joint account without both signatures. The realtor assumed I would be signing as well. Harold swallowed hard and admitted that he would have to pay the deposit from his own funds if he wanted to move forward. His voice trembled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. I stirred my tea gently and said nothing. Later that evening, he met his friends for drinks, and when he returned, his mood had worsened. He said they questioned why I would leave after so many years. He said they suggested that I must be having an emotional crisis, that women my age became irrational when they felt overlooked. His eyes searched mine for outrage, but I remained composed. He continued speaking and eventually admitted that one of his friends implied that he must have done something to drive me away. The comment wounded him in a way my silence never could. His pride had been pierced, and the world he curated so carefully had begun to crumble. The next shift came when our son Evan called. His voice carried uncertainty, as though he were stepping onto ice he feared might crack. He asked if it was true that I had filed for divorce. I told him yes, in a calm tone that left no room for speculation. He asked why, and I told him gently that I could no longer live a life in which I was unseen. He fell silent. I could almost hear his thoughts moving, sorting, questioning. He said that Harold told him I was overreacting, that I was abandoning the family. I closed my eyes and waited a moment before responding. I told him that leaving did not mean abandoning. It meant choosing truth over pretense. He did not answer right away. There was a quiet tremor in his voice when he spoke again. He said he was torn. He said he loved us both. He said he did not know whose side he should be on. His words carried the ache of a child, even though he was grown. I told him that he did not have to choose sides. I told him that supporting me did not require rejecting his father. I told him that loving someone did not mean excusing their blindness. He breathed out slowly, and I could hear the conflict settling deep inside him. I could hear him wondering what he would do if he were in my place. The call ended with uncertainty rather than resolution, and I knew listeners would feel the weight of his dilemma. They would ask themselves what loyalty meant. They would feel the ache of choosing between truth and tradition. They would feel the discomfort of questioning a parent they once admired. The moral conflict was not dramatic, but it was piercing. It revealed the quiet fractures that run through families when truth finally rises. Harold grew quieter in the days that followed. He watched me with a mixture of confusion and fear, as though trying to understand how the woman he underestimated had changed without raising her voice. His confidence weakened, his posture shifted, his certainty faded. The house felt different, not because its walls had changed, but because I no longer filled them with invisible labor. I moved through the rooms with purposeful grace, no longer shrinking, no longer dimming myself to maintain his comfort. Anyone watching would recognize the consequences not as punishment, but as balance, returning. A man who believed he owned the world now stood in the shadow of his own choices. A woman who had given everything now stood in the quiet power of taking herself back. The day I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases felt strangely calm. There was no shouting, no pleading, no dramatic goodbye. Harold stood in the doorway of the living room, watching me without knowing what to say. The silence between us stretched like a long hallway with no doors. I folded each item with care, not out of sentiment, but out of intention. I was leaving the house I had kept running for decades, yet I did not feel displaced. I felt as though I were stepping back into myself. When I rolled the suitcases to the front door, Harold finally spoke, asking where I planned to go. I answered softly that I would stay somewhere temporary until the legal process finished. He nodded, unsure how to respond. His certainty no longer held power over me. I stayed in a small rental above a bakery where the scent of warm bread drifted through the window each morning. The space was modest, with a single lamp, a narrow bed, and a chipped table, yet it felt expansive. I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. I could move without being observed. I could breathe without shrinking. For the first time in years, I woke to silence that comforted rather than confined me. I made tea in the tiny kitchenette and sat by the window, watching people begin their day with unburdened footsteps. Within a week, I applied for a position at a logistics company that worked with German partners. I submitted the application online, including a brief note that I was fluent enough to assist with communication. When they called me for an interview, I felt a flutter of nerves mixed with a quiet pride. I dressed simply and arrived early, sitting in the lobby with my hands folded in my lap. The walls were lined with framed photographs of international contracts and handshakes. When the hiring manager greeted me, she looked surprised when I introduced myself with steady confidence. The interview moved smoothly, and when she switched into German to test my ability, I responded without hesitation. The words flowed more easily than I expected, shaped by the nights of disciplined study and the love that fueled it. She raised her eyebrows in impressed surprise. She asked where I learned. I told her it came from a promise and perseverance. She smiled, and there was warmth in the way she looked at me. At the end of the interview, she said they would contact me soon. The next morning, she called to offer me a position. I accepted, feeling a spark of joy ignite inside me. The first week at the company felt like stepping onto new ground that welcomed my footsteps rather than absorbing them unnoticed. I answered emails, translated documents, and sat in meetings where my input carried weight. My colleagues treated me with respect, listening when I spoke, thanking me when I contributed. I felt myself straightening, not out of defense, but out of belonging. Each day, I walked back to the rental with a feeling I had almost forgotten: fulfillment. One afternoon, the company prepared for a major negotiation with a German partner, and tension filled the office. Documents had been exchanged, but there were misunderstandings delaying progress. The team gathered in the conference room, and the manager asked if I could join. I sat quietly at first, listening to both sides struggle to find clarity. Then I stepped in, translating not only the words, but the tone, the nuance, the intention. The shift in the conversation was immediate. Shoulders relaxed, voices softened. Agreements began forming like bridges across a river. When the call ended successfully, the room fell into relieved laughter. The manager stood, smiling broadly. She told the team that they would not have secured the contract without me. She said it with sincerity, not politeness. Applause rose around the table, and colleagues touched my shoulder, thanking me. I felt warmth spread through my chest, not as validation from others, but as recognition of myself. I had built something with my own hands, my own mind, my own quiet perseverance. I smiled, not widely, but deeply. That evening, as I walked home, the sky glowed with soft twilight. I passed couples talking, families laughing, and teenagers racing bicycles along the sidewalk. The bakery below my rental was closing for the night, and the owner handed me a small loaf of bread as a gift. I carried it upstairs and sat by the window with the bread and a cup of tea. The city lights flickered like distant stars. I felt no regret, no fear, no longing for the life I left behind. I felt steady. I felt rooted. I felt free. Anyone watching would understand that this was not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet arrival, the first taste of a life in which I belonged to myself. The day of the signing arrived with a sky that was clear and sharply blue, the kind of day that might have once lifted my mood without my noticing. I dressed with deliberate simplicity, choosing a blouse and jacket that made me feel composed rather than decorative. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman whose reflection finally matched her own sense of self. I breathed slowly, gathering calmness like a cloak around my shoulders. Then I made my way to the law office where the meeting was scheduled. The building was modern, with glass walls that reflected the sunlight in bright patterns. I entered the conference room to find Harold already seated, his posture confident, his expression triumphant. He wore a suit he reserved for moments when he believed he was ascending socially. He greeted me with a tone that attempted civility, yet carried tension beneath it. He assumed my presence signaled surrender. He assumed that my calmness meant compliance. He assumed many things. The realtor and the attorney sat across the table, organizing documents into neat stacks. Harold leaned back in his chair and spoke about how quickly the sale would move once the signatures were complete. He mentioned the view again, the status, the impression the apartment would create among his peers. His voice filled the room the way it always had, claiming space without awareness. I listened with steady silence, letting his words roll past me like distant waves that no longer reached the shore. The attorney asked us to review the contract before signing. She slid the paperwork toward Harold first. He adjusted his glasses and began scanning the pages with a satisfied smirk. His pen rested confidently in his hand. Then his expression shifted. His eyes narrowed. He leaned closer to the document, reading again as though the text might change if he stared hard enough. His breath quickened and the smirk dissolved into confusion. He looked up at the attorney, then at the realtor, and finally at me. He said there must be an error. He tapped the section that listed ownership. His voice wavered slightly as he read aloud the line that shattered his certainty. Owner, Irene Marshall. The words hung in the room like a bell that had just been struck, resonating through every corner. He looked at me, searching for an explanation, searching for the woman he thought he knew. The silence between us carried more power than any argument ever had. I held his gaze with calm steadiness. I told him that I had completed the purchase agreement through separate legal channels. I told him that I had documented my contributions, secured representation, and ensured that the contract reflected my rightful position. His face paled, and his posture collapsed inward. He asked how I managed it. He asked when it happened. He asked why I did not tell him. His voice trembled with disbelief, and beneath it, fear. I answered softly, telling him that I did not need to argue to be respected. I told him that I only needed to walk away. The room fell utterly still. The realtor shifted awkwardly. The attorney maintained a neutral expression, though her eyes held the faintest glimmer of admiration. Harold stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. The certainty he once wielded like a weapon dissolved in front of him. His hand, still holding the pen, lowered slowly to the table. He attempted to speak again, but his voice cracked. He said that people would talk. He said that his colleagues would question him. He said that this would humiliate him. I listened without reacting. His concerns revolved around image, perception, and pride. They did not touch the truth. I told him that the story he told others was his concern, not mine. The words were gentle, yet final. He exhaled sharply, as though struck by a blow he never anticipated. The attorney guided the remainder of the process with professional efficiency. I signed the final page with a steady hand. She congratulated me with a quiet nod. When the meeting ended, Harold remained seated, stunned, unable to stand for several moments. I walked toward the door with calm footsteps, feeling the weight of years lifting from my shoulders like dust brushed from fabric. As I reached the hallway, I paused and looked back. He still sat motionless, staring at the contract bearing my name. Stepping outside, the sunlight felt warmer than when I arrived. The air carried a freshness that filled my lungs with ease. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk with a sense of grounding I had not felt in decades. I did not rush. I did not tremble. I moved with the quiet assurance of someone who reclaimed her own life with dignity instead of destruction. Anyone watching would recognize that revenge did not always come through fire or fury. Sometimes it arrived in silence. Sometimes it appeared in the form of a signature written with steady grace. Sometimes the most powerful. Justice was simply walking away and letting the truth stand on its own. My footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. The world around me seemed clearer, the sounds sharper, the sky wider. I felt the strength of every choice that led me here. I felt the peace that followed, and I knew that this was not the end of the journey. But the moment, everything finally aligned with who I had become. 1 year passed with a gentleness I never expected. The seasons shifted across the city, and I watched them unfold from the tall windows of the apartment that now belonged entirely to me. In the morning, sunlight poured across the hardwood floors in soft golden stripes. I would wake up slowly, not to an alarm or a list of demands, but to the steady rhythm of my own breath. The space felt alive in a way that reflected my inner landscape, quiet, expansive, and filled with possibilities. I tended to plants along the windowsill, their leaves stretching toward the light like small declarations of resilience. I brewed tea at my own pace and sat at the dining table with open mornings instead of obligations. My work at the company grew into something meaningful. My colleagues valued my presence, not out of politeness, but because my contributions mattered. I translated contracts, mediated misunderstandings, and offered clarity where confusion once stalled progress. The management team began inviting me into broader conversations, trusting my insight. I was no longer invisible. I was seen, heard, and respected. I walked into the office each day with a sense of belonging that came not from permission, but from recognition, earned through patience and skill. Evan visited more often than before. At first, he arrived with hesitation, unsure of how to navigate the new distance between his father and me. He brought pastries from a bakery near his apartment and sat on the couch, glancing around the space with quiet admiration. Over time, his uncertainty faded. He stopped asking whether I planned to return and instead asked how I was enjoying my life. He told me he understood now, that he saw what he had not seen before. He apologized for not recognizing the weight I carried all those years. I told him that healing did not require blame. He rested his head briefly against my shoulder, and in that moment we found a new way of being mother and son. Harold remained a distant figure. The divorce finalized smoothly, and the settlement reflected the truth the courts could no longer ignore. He sold the house and moved into a smaller place. I heard from acquaintances that he struggled with the shift in his reputation, that his friends no longer admired him the way they once did. I did not celebrate his discomfort, but neither did I shoulder responsibility for it. His story was no longer mine to carry. Sometimes healing is not about reconciliation, but release. I wished him peace from afar and let the past rest where it belonged. Matthias visited every few weeks, always calling. Ahead with courteous consideration. He arrived carrying fresh bread or a newspaper in German for me to practice with. His presence felt steady, like a familiar piece of music played softly in the background. We sat by the window and talked about language, memory, and the way human beings survive what they once thought would break them. He never spoke of heroism regarding Elena's treatments. He insisted that kindness should not require applause. Over time, he became something like family, not a romantic possibility, but a dignified anchor, a quiet companion in the ongoing work of healing. One afternoon, as sunlight washed across the living room, Matthias rested his hand gently on mine. He told me that Elena would have been proud of the woman I had become. His voice carried tenderness without sorrow. I felt tears gather, but they were born from warmth, not pain. When he left that day, he paused at the door and said that some lives bloom late, and that blooming late does not make them any less beautiful. I stood for a long moment after he walked down the hallway, letting his words settle like soft soil around new roots. That evening, I opened the drawer of my writing desk and took out the small German dictionary. Its cover was worn smooth from years of being held. I opened it to the final blank page. The room was quiet, illuminated only by the amber glow of a lamp. My pen hovered for a moment as I breathed deeply. Then I wrote the sentence that had lived inside me for months. Months, growing stronger with each step I took. I wrote that I was not something discarded. I wrote that I was the foundation of my own life. The words looked steady and confident on the page, and as I read them back to myself, I felt a wave of peace move through me. I closed the dictionary gently and placed it on the table, allowing its presence to rest in the open. The night air drifted in through a small window, carrying the subtle scent of the city settling into sleep. I stood and walked to the balcony. The lights along the river shimmered, reflecting movement and stillness all at once. I rested my hands on the railing and let the world breathe around me. There was no triumphant music, no grand announcement, just a quiet knowing that life had shifted into alignment with who I was meant to be. Anyone watching would feel the resonance of it. Anyone listening would understand that healing does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper. Sometimes it takes the shape of a woman standing in her own light after a lifetime in the shadows. And so, as the final closing of my story settles gently, I offer a question to those who carry their own quiet wounds. If you have lived through something similar, if you have ever felt unseen, unheard, or diminished, what do you think of the choice I made? Did I do the right thing? Would you have found the courage to walk, or are you still waiting for permission to begin again?